The Kansas wind carried dust and memories in equal measure across the plains that stretched endlessly beneath a merciless August sun. Samuel Thornton stood on the porch of his weathered homestead, his calloused hands gripping the rough-hewn railing as he watched another day bleed into the horizon. The house behind him echoed with silence, a sound more deafening than any prairie storm. 3 years had passed since consumption took Martha from him. 3 years of empty chairs and cold beds, of cooking for one and talking to shadows. The neighbors said time would heal, but Samuel knew better. Time only made the emptiness grow roots, spreading through every corner of his life like prairie grass through untended soil. He was 42 years old, though the mirror reflected a man who'd lived a decade longer. Gray threaded through his dark beard, and lines carved deep around eyes that had seen too much loss. His shoulders, broad from years of breaking sod and building fences, seemed to carry invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing season. Inside the house, Martha's rocking chair sat motionless by the hearth. Her sewing basket remained on the small table beside it, needles and thread waiting for hands that would never return. Samuel couldn't bring himself to move these things. They were anchors to a life that once held warmth, reminders of evenings filled with quiet contentment and shared dreams. The farm prospered under his careful hand. 60 acres of good wheat land, a solid barn, 20 head of cattle, and a well that never ran dry even in the harshest drought. By frontier standards, he was a successful man. But success meant nothing when there was no one to share it with. No voices to fill the empty spaces between sunrise and sunset. Samuel's nearest neighbor, Tom Crawford, often invited him for Sunday dinners. "You need to move on, Sam," Tom would say, watching his own children chase chickens around the yard. "Find yourself a new wife. This territory's full of widows and young women looking for a good man with established land." But Samuel couldn't imagine courting again. The thought of replacing Martha felt like betrayal, even as the loneliness gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. He'd tried attending the church socials, standing awkwardly at the edge of conversations, but the young women seemed like strangers speaking a foreign tongue, and the widows carried their own ghosts that reminded him too sharply of his own. What he wanted wasn't just a wife to cook and mend. He wanted what he'd lost, the fullness of a home alive with purpose, the chaos of family life that made a man's work meaningful. He remembered Martha's dream of filling their house with children, of teaching daughters to bake bread and sons to read the weather. That dream had died with her, buried beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill behind the house. Some evenings, Samuel would sit on the porch and imagine different voices calling from inside, children arguing over chores, a woman humming while she worked, the comfortable sounds of life being lived. These fantasies hurt worse than memories, because they showed him what never was and likely never would be. The town of Cedar Hollow lay 8 miles east, a collection of false-fronted buildings that passed for civilization on the Kansas frontier. Samuel made the trip once a week for supplies, enduring the ritual of polite conversation with shopkeepers who'd long ago stopped asking how he was managing. He'd become part of the landscape, the widower Thornton, reliable as rainfall, solitary as a fence post. It was during one of these supply runs that Samuel first heard the talk. He was loading flour sacks onto his wagon when 2 men outside the mercantile caught his attention. "Judge says it's legal," one said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Woman owes more than her land's worth. Bank's got the right to sell everything, including her and those young ones." "Ain't Christian," the other replied, though his tone suggested curiosity more than condemnation. "Selling a family like livestock. Times are hard. That Simpson woman should have thought of that before her husband up and died owing half the county." Samuel's hands stilled on the flour sacks. He'd heard of such things happening further west, where law bent to necessity and desperation drove people to unthinkable choices. But here in Cedar Hollow, where folks still pretended civilization had taken root, the first man continued. "Auction set for next Tuesday. Judge Aldrich himself will oversee it. Says whoever takes on the family takes on the remaining debt. But it's less than hiring hands would cost. And you get a woman who can cook and clean besides." Samuel climbed onto his wagon seat, his mind churning with the ugliness of what he'd heard. A widow and her children, reduced to property because of debts not their making. It violated every principle of decency he'd been raised with. Yet he understood the cruel mathematics of frontier survival. Without a man's protection and income, a woman with children faced impossible odds. As he drove home, the conversation haunted him. He thought of Martha. How vulnerable she would have been if their positions had been reversed. The thought of any woman facing such humiliation made his jaw clench, but mixed with his anger was something else, a stirring he didn't want to examine too closely. That night, Samuel lay wakeful in his too large bed. Staring at the ceiling beams, he'd hewn himself when hope still lived in this house. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled its loneliness to the stars. He tried not to think about Tuesday's auction, about a family standing on the block like cattle, but the image wouldn't leave him. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel allowed himself to imagine his house full again, not with a bride chosen from the eligible young women at church socials, but with a ready-made family born from necessity. It was an arrangement that would save them from separation and destitution while filling his empty rooms with life. The thought shamed him. What kind of man considered buying a family? Yet what kind of man would stand by while children were parceled out to whoever bid highest, their mother sent to work in conditions that didn't bear contemplating? Samuel rose before dawn, unable to bear the bed any longer. He made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe and stood on the porch watching the sky lighten. The land stretched before him, patient and enduring, waiting for another day's labor. But for the first time in years, the emptiness felt like possibility rather than penance. He had 5 days to decide, 5 days to determine whether he was the kind of man who could offer sanctuary to strangers, who could open his closed-off heart to a family not of his making. 5 days to choose between the safety of solitude and the terrifying prospect of hope. As the sun broke the horizon, painting the wheat fields gold, Samuel made his decision. Come Tuesday, he would attend that auction. Not as a spectator to others' misery, but as a man with empty rooms and a fortune in loneliness to spend. Whatever came after, it couldn't be worse than another winter of talking to shadows and Martha's ghost. He didn't pray often anymore, but that morning Samuel bowed his head and asked for guidance. If Martha was listening from whatever better place she'd found, he hoped she would understand. This wasn't about replacing her. It was about honoring what they'd built together by filling it with the life it was meant to hold. The wind picked up, stirring the wheat into golden waves. Somewhere, a meadowlark sang its morning prayer. Samuel squared his shoulders and went inside to begin his day's work, carrying with him a purpose he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Tuesday arrived with a cloudless sky that promised no mercy from the heat. Samuel dressed in his best shirt, the one Martha had sewn 2 winters before her death, and brushed the dust from his seldom-worn town hat. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man preparing for church or court, not for what lay ahead. The ride to Cedar Hollow seemed longer than usual. Other wagons converged on the town, carrying men whose faces Samuel recognized but whose intentions he couldn't read. Some would come for the spectacle, others for darker purposes. His jaw tightened as he considered what manner of man might bid on children as if they were plow horses. The auction was set for the courtyard behind the bank, a patch of packed earth usually reserved for livestock sales. Samuel tethered his horse and made his way through the gathering crowd. The atmosphere hung thick with anticipation and cruelty. Conversations peppered with coarse laughter and speculation. "Heard the oldest girl's pretty enough?" someone said. "Might be worth taking the whole lot just for her. Woman's probably worn out from bearing 4 young ones," another replied. "But she can still work, I reckon." Samuel's fists clenched involuntarily. He moved away from the voices, finding a place near the platform where he could see clearly. Judge Aldrich stood beside the auctioneer, his presence lending legal weight to the proceedings. The judge's face remained impassive, but Samuel noticed how he avoided meeting anyone's eyes directly. Then they were brought out. The widow came first, her chin raised despite the circumstances. Eleanor Simpson couldn't have been older than 30, though hardship had etched premature lines around her eyes. Her dress, though clean and carefully mended, showed the wear of too many washings. Brown hair pulled back in a severe bun revealed a face that might have been called handsome in better times. Behind her, 4 children clustered like quail seeking shelter. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 12, held her mother's hand while trying to shield the younger ones. She had her mother's brown hair and a fierce look that dared anyone to come too close. A boy of 10 stood soldier straight, his young face set in lines too hard for his years. 2 smaller children, a girl who might have been 7 and a boy no more than 5, pressed against their siblings, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The auctioneer, a man named Hartwell, whom Samuel knew to be fond of whiskey and cards, cleared his throat. By order of the circuit court, we're here to settle the debts of the late Charles Simpson. The family before you is able-bodied and capable of work. The widow Simpson is skilled in household management, and the children are old enough to earn their keep. A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor Simpson's face remained stone, but Samuel saw her hand tighten on her daughter's until both sets of knuckles showed white. Bidding starts at $50 for the lot. Hartwell announced. "Who'll give me 50? 25 for just the woman," called a voice from the back. Samuel turned to see Edgar Pike, who ran the boarding house near the saloon. The implications of his specific interest made Samuel's stomach turn. "The court's terms are clear," Judge Aldrich interjected, his voice carrying forced authority. "The family is to be kept together." $30 then. Pike amended with a shrug that suggested he'd find ways around such restrictions. 35, another man called out. Samuel recognized him as a farmer from the next county, known for working his hired hands near to death. The bidding continued in $5 increments. Each call drawing winces from Eleanor Simpson, though she tried to hide them. The children pressed closer together. The youngest boy began to cry silently, tears tracking through the dust on his cheeks. $60, Pike called out, impatience coloring his tone. "And that's generous for a woman and 4 mouths to feed." Samuel watched the family on the platform. The older boy had moved to comfort his little brother, whispering something that made the child bury his face against his shoulder. The gesture, protective, gentle, stirred something in Samuel's chest. $60 going once, Hartwell began. Samuel stepped forward. $100. The courtyard fell silent. Heads turned to identify the bidder. Samuel kept his eyes on the platform, where Eleanor Simpson had turned to look at him fully for the first time. Her expression showed surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. "Well now," Pike drawled, pushing through the crowd. "Sam Thornton, finally looking to warm that cold bed of yours?" Samuel didn't acknowledge the crude comment. He stood steady, hands loose at his sides, radiating the quiet threat of a man who'd faced down claim jumpers and cattle thieves. 120, Pike countered, his smile sharp as broken glass. 200, Samuel said without hesitation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was more than many men saw in a year, more than the debt itself. Pike's face reddened, but calculation flickered in his eyes as he weighed the cost against whatever plans he'd harbored. 250, Pike spat. Samuel finally looked at the other man directly. Pike was soft where years of easy living showed, cruel where nature and choice had carved mean lines. Everything about him spoke of a man who saw others as tools for his use. 300, Samuel said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. Pike opened his mouth, closed it, then laughed. An ugly sound. "She must be something special for you to pay so dear. Thornton, hope she's worth it." The crowd parted as Pike shouldered his way out, followed by several other men who'd lost interest once the price exceeded their means or intentions. Those who remained watched with curiosity and speculation. 300 going once, Hartwell called, seeming eager to conclude the distasteful business. Going twice, sold to Samuel Thornton. Judge Aldrich gestured for Samuel to approach the makeshift desk where papers waited. As Samuel signed his name and counted out bills from the leather pouch he'd brought, he was aware of Eleanor Simpson watching him. her children still clustered around her like a living shield. "The debt is transferred to you," the judge said quietly. "The remaining balance is $73. To be settled as you see fit. They're yours to direct." The words tasted bitter. Samuel folded the papers and turned to face the family he'd just purchased, though he refused to think of it in those terms. Up close, he could see details distance had hidden: the careful darns in the children's clothing, the way they stood despite exhaustion, the fierce dignity Eleanor Simpson maintained even now. "Ma'am," Samuel said, removing his hat, "if you and your children will come with me, we can be away from here." She studied him for a long moment, this stranger who'd bought them like cattle. "Do we have a choice?" "There's always a choice," Samuel replied, "though I reckon none of them are good ones just now." Something in his tone, perhaps the acknowledgement of the impossible situation, made her shoulders relax fractionally. She nodded once, then turned to her children. "Come," she said simply. They descended from the platform, the crowd parting with whispers and stares. Samuel led them to his wagon, lifting the smaller children into the bed while their mother and older siblings climbed up on their own. He'd brought blankets, anticipating the need, and spread them to provide some comfort for the journey. As they left Cedar Hollow behind, Samuel heard the oldest girl speak for the first time. "Where are you taking us?" He glanced back to meet her suspicious gaze. "Home," he said. "It's about an hour's ride. Good land. Plenty of room." Are we going to be servants?" the boy asked, trying to sound brave. Samuel considered his words carefully. "You're going to be safe," he said finally. "The rest, we'll figure out as we go." Eleanor Simpson remained silent throughout the exchange, her arms around the younger children, her face turned away from the receding town. Samuel didn't press for conversation. He imagined the humiliation burned fierce enough without words to fan it. The prairie stretched before them, grass bending in waves beneath the wind. Samuel drove steady but not fast, mindful of the children who'd likely walked far that morning. The sun climbed higher, and he stopped once to offer water from his canteen, which was accepted with quiet thanks. As his homestead came into view, the house, barn, and outbuildings neat against the horizon, Samuel heard a small intake of breath behind him. He tried to see it through their eyes. Substantial, isolated, unknown, a prison or a sanctuary, depending on what came next. He pulled up before the house, setting the brake carefully. "This is it," he said unnecessarily. Eleanor Simpson looked at the house, then at him. For the first time, something other than defensive pride showed in her expression, a fragile hope she couldn't quite hide. "It's substantial," she said. "It's empty," Samuel replied, surprising himself with the honesty. "Has been for 3 years. Figured it might be less so now." He helped them down from the wagon, noting how the children stayed close to their mother, how she kept them within arm's reach. The youngest boy had fallen asleep and didn't wake even when Samuel lifted him down, passing the child to his mother with careful hands. Standing before his house with his purchased family, Samuel felt the weight of what he'd done settle full upon him. These weren't hired hands who'd leave come season's end. These were lives he'd taken responsibility for, futures he'd altered with his bid. "Come inside," he said, moving to open the door. "We'll get you settled, and then we'll see what comes next." As they crossed the threshold into the house that had stood empty too long, Samuel caught Eleanor Simpson's whispered words to her children. "Remember your manners. We don't know yet what kind of man he is." No, Samuel thought, stepping aside to let them enter. They didn't know. He wasn't entirely sure himself anymore. But as sunlight spilled across Martha's clean-swept floors and children's voices finally broke the silence, he felt something shift in his chest, a door long closed beginning to crack open. The house seemed to hold its breath as they entered, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light that slanted through clean windows. Samuel watched the family take in their surroundings, the sturdy furniture he'd built with his own hands, the stone fireplace that dominated one wall, the kitchen with its well-maintained stove and orderly shelves. "The bedrooms are upstairs," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "3 of them. You can arrange yourselves however suits." Eleanor Simpson set down her youngest boy, who'd awakened and now clung to her skirts. Her eyes moved carefully over everything, as if memorizing escape routes. "Where do you sleep?" "Down here." Samuel gestured to a small room off the kitchen. "Moved my things after. It's easier, being close to the stove come winter." Understanding flickered across her face. She'd noticed, then, the feminine touches that lingered despite 3 years' absence. Martha's curtains at the windows, the quilt rack she'd asked him to make. Small ghosts of a life interrupted. "Children," Eleanor said quietly, "let's look at the upstairs." Samuel didn't follow. He busied himself building up the fire that had burned low during his absence, then set water to heat. His hands moved through familiar motions while his ears tracked the unfamiliar sounds above. Footsteps, whispered conversations, a door creaking open. When they descended, the children seemed marginally less wary. The oldest girl, Samuel realized he didn't even know their names, spoke first. "The rooms are very clean. I keep things tidy," Samuel replied, then felt foolish for the obvious statement. He cleared his throat. "I should know your names." Eleanor straightened, as if preparing for inspection. "I'm Eleanor. This is Margaret." She indicated the oldest girl. "James," the boy who stood protective near his siblings. "Rose," the middle girl with large brown eyes. "And Thomas." The youngest boy peered out from behind his mother's skirts. "I'm Samuel Thornton," he said, though they likely knew from the auction. "Are you hungry? I've got stew from yesterday, and bread. We don't want to," Eleanor began, but Samuel cut her off with a gesture. "You're here now. No point in going hungry." He ladled stew into bowls, sliced thick pieces of bread. The children watched every movement, and he realized they were memorizing where things were kept, how the kitchen was organized, smart, cautious. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against pottery. Samuel noticed how the older children waited until the younger ones had taken their first bites, how Eleanor barely touched her own food until certain her children had enough. When the meal was finished, Margaret rose automatically to clear the dishes. Samuel almost protested, then stopped himself. They needed to find their way here, establish some sense of purpose and routine. "There's a pump out back for water," he said instead. "Soap's in the tin beside it." As Margaret worked, Eleanor finally asked, "What are your expectations?" Samuel had been dreading this conversation. He pushed his coffee cup between his hands, searching for words that wouldn't sound either crude or condescending. "I expect you'll need time to settle. The house hasn't had a woman's touch in 3 years. You'll likely find things that need doing I've gone blind to. The children, they're young. They need schooling, proper raising. And me," her voice carried steel beneath the quiet tone. "What service do you expect from me?" He met her eyes directly. "I expect nothing you're not willing to give. There's the spare room upstairs. You can put a bolt on the inside if it makes you feel safer. I bought your family to keep you together and safe, not for what men like Pike intended." She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she could see straight through to his soul. Finally, she nodded. "The children can help with chores. They're used to work." "They're children," Samuel said. "There's work enough for everyone, but they'll not be treated as slaves in this house." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, surprise, perhaps, or the first loosening of fear. Thomas had crept closer during the conversation and now stood near Samuel's chair, staring at him with the unabashed curiosity of the very young. "You're big," the boy announced. "Thomas!" Eleanor reached for him, but Samuel waved her back. "I suppose I am," he agreed solemnly. "Makes it easier to reach the high shelves." Thomas considered this. "Can you reach the cookies?" "If there were cookies to reach," Samuel said. "I probably could. We could make some." Rose piped up, then caught herself, looking to her mother for permission. Eleanor's face softened fractionally. "If Mr. Thornton has the makings. Samuel, he corrected. And I believe I do. Martha, he stopped, cleared his throat. There should be what you need. The afternoon passed in careful navigation. Samuel showed them the house properly, the root cellar, the pantry, where linens were kept. Eleanor asked practical questions about laundry days, water heating, the stove's quirks. The children gradually spread out, exploring with the resilience of youth beginning to assert itself over fear. As evening approached, Samuel excused himself to tend the animals. The barn's familiar smells and sounds provided relief from the house's new tensions. He fed the horses, checked the cattle, his hands moving through evening chores while his mind churned. What had he done? The question pecked at him like a persistent crow. He'd brought strangers into Martha's house, filled her kitchen with children she'd never meet. But when he looked back toward the house, seeing lamplight warm in the windows and shadows moving behind the curtains, something eased in his chest. When he returned, he found a transformed scene. The kitchen smelled of baking, and Eleanor stood at the stove with Rose beside her, both flour-dusted and focused. Margaret set the table while James minded Thomas, keeping the boy from underfoot with some game involving spoons and buttons. "Supper's nearly ready," Eleanor said without turning. There was something different in her voice. Not warmth, exactly, but a lessening of sharp wariness. They ate biscuits and gravy. Simple fare made somehow better by the preparation. Samuel complimented the cooking and received a brief, surprised smile from Rose. Even James unbent enough to accept a second helping without the stiff formality he'd shown earlier. After supper, the dance of bedtime began. Samuel kept to his corner, watching over the edge of a week-old newspaper as Eleanor herded the children upstairs. He heard water splashing, protests about washing behind ears, the universal negotiations of parents and children everywhere. When she returned downstairs, the house had settled into quiet. She stood uncertainly in the doorway, and Samuel gestured to Martha's chair by the fire. After a moment's hesitation, she sat. "They're good children," he said. "They've had to be." She stared into the flames. "After Charles died, we tried to keep the farm going, but the drought last summer, then the bank calling in loans." She trailed off. Samuel understood. The frontier was littered with such stories. "The land here is good, water's reliable. You'll not face that again. Because you own us now." The words came bitter. "Because you're here now," he corrected gently. "The law might say one thing, but I'm not a man who holds with owning people. You want to leave come spring. We'll work out the debt somehow. But for now, with winter coming, this seems the best solution for everyone." She turned to look at him fully. "Why did you do it? Really?" Samuel set aside his newspaper. The question deserved honesty. "This house was built for a family. It's been empty too long. I've been empty too long. Maybe I saw a chance to fix both problems at once. And if we disappoint you, if the children are too loud, too much trouble, if I'm not the woman your wife was." "You're not her," Samuel said simply. "Don't try to be. As for the children, a house this quiet could use some noise." Eleanor absorbed this, her fingers worrying at a loose thread on her cuff. "I don't know how to be grateful for this. I'm too angry still, too proud." "I'm not asking for gratitude. Just give it time. Let the children feel safe. Let yourself rest a bit. We'll figure out the rest as we go." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "I should check on them." "Eleanor," Samuel called as she reached the stairs. She turned. "What are their ages?" "Exactly?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Margaret's 12, James is 10, Rose is 7, and Thomas is 5. She paused. "Their birthdays are all written in the Bible, if that matters." "It matters," Samuel said. After she went upstairs, Samuel banked the fire and made his own preparations for bed. As he lay in the narrow bed in his downstairs room, he could hear the house settling around its new occupants. A floorboard creaked overhead. Someone coughed. Small sounds that meant life where there had been only silence. He thought of Martha, wondering what she would make of this. She'd been a practical woman underneath her gentleness. She'd understand, he thought. the need to fill emptiness with purpose, to choose hope over the safety of solitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The children would need clothes for school. Eleanor would begin the delicate process of making another woman's house her own. The town would talk. Lord knows they'd talk. And Samuel would have to navigate being a sudden father figure to children who had every reason to mistrust men's intentions. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, the house felt right. Not the same as before, that was gone forever, but right in a new way, like a broken bone beginning to knit, as sleep finally took him. Samuel heard footsteps above, Eleanor checking on her children one more time. The sound of a mother's vigilance, of care taking root in empty rooms, followed him into dreams where Martha smiled and nodded, giving her blessing to this strange new chapter. The first week passed in careful distances. Samuel rose before dawn each day, leaving coffee warming on the stove before heading to the fields. He'd return to find breakfast prepared, eaten in silence broken only by necessary exchanges about supplies or household matters. Eleanor maintained a careful formality, addressing him as Mr. Thornton, despite his repeated requests otherwise. The children watched him with the wariness of young animals learning which shadows meant danger. They scattered when he entered rooms, spoke in whispers that died when he drew near. Only Thomas, with the fearlessness of the very young, sometimes forgot to be afraid, following Samuel to the barn until Margaret or James pulled him back. Samuel didn't push. He worked his fields, mended fences, and left small offerings of normalcy. A wooden horse carved during evening hours appeared on the kitchen table, meant for Thomas but unclaimed for 2 days until it vanished into the boy's pocket. Fresh wildflowers filled a jar by the window each morning. Prairie roses and black-eyed Susans that made Rose peek at them when she thought no one was looking. The second week brought subtle shifts. Samuel returned from checking cattle to find James struggling with the water pump, the handle stiff from lack of oil. The boy jumped when Samuel approached, ready to flee. "Needs greasing," Samuel said mildly. Fetching the oil can from the barn, he worked the oil into the mechanism, then stepped back. "Try it now." James pumped tentatively, then with more confidence as the handle moved smoothly. "Thank you, sir," he mumbled. "Your father teach you about maintaining equipment?" Samuel asked, keeping his tone conversational. "Yes, sir. He said taking care of tools meant they'd take care of you." "Smart man." Samuel wiped his hands on a rag. "There's more needs tending if you're interested. Not ordering, just offering. Boy your age might like knowing how things work." James glanced toward the house where his mother was visible through the window. Maybe. "Door's open if you decide," Samuel said, and left it at that. 3 days later, he found James in the barn, studying the harness that needed repair. Samuel worked beside him in companionable silence, showing how to punch new holes in leather, how to judge if a strap would hold. The boy's hands were quick and clever, needing only one demonstration before understanding. "You're good at this," Samuel observed. A flush of pride colored James's cheeks before wariness reasserted itself. "Pa needed help. After he got sick, I tried to keep things running. That's a heavy load for 10-year-old shoulders." James shrugged, but Samuel caught the flash of gratitude for understanding. They worked until Eleanor's call to supper, and the next morning, James appeared in the barn without prompting. Margaret proved harder to reach. At 12, she'd appointed herself her mother's guardian, watching Samuel with dark suspicion. She kept Rose close, intervening whenever her sister showed signs of softening, but Samuel noticed things, how her eyes lingered on his small shelf of books, how she held herself straighter when he complimented her mother's cooking, careful not to include her in the praise, though she'd clearly helped. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Samuel returned from town with supplies, including a slate and chalk he'd bought on impulse, thinking of the children's education. He found Margaret in the kitchen, tears streaming as she clutched a mixing bowl. "I ruined it," she said, forgetting to be cold in her distress. "Mama trusted me with the bread, and I ruined it." Samuel peered into the bowl at the flat. Lifeless dough. "Forgot the saleratus?" She nodded miserably. Mama's resting. She's been tired, and I wanted to help, but now there's no bread for supper, and bread's not ruined yet. Samuel interrupted gently, just sleeping heavier than usual. Let me show you something my mother taught me. He added a bit more leavening, worked the dough with practiced hands while explaining the rescue. Margaret watched intently, her usual suspicion replaced by desperate attention. When the dough began showing signs of life, her shoulders sagged with relief. Won't be as light as your mother's, Samuel warned. But it'll eat fine. Thank you, Margaret whispered, then caught herself, stiffening again. But when Samuel handed her the bowl to finish kneading, she took it without shrinking away. Rose remained shy, but began appearing wherever Samuel worked, a small shadow with her mother's brown eyes. She never spoke directly to him, but left tiny gifts where he'd find them. A particularly smooth stone on his porch chair, a bird's feather tucked into the barn door handle, a cluster of late sunflowers by the water trough. Samuel acknowledged each gift with equal subtlety. The stone found its way to the mantelpiece, displayed where she could see it. The feather became a bookmark in the Bible he read Sunday mornings. The sunflowers moved to the kitchen table in Martha's good vase. Thomas provided the least complicated relationship, too young for the fears that guided his siblings. He simply accepted Samuel as part of his new landscape. The wooden horse became his constant companion, and Samuel often found the boy conducting serious conversations with it about everything from the weather to what cookies might taste like if they had any. One evening, Samuel sat on the porch mending a bridle when Thomas appeared, horse in hand. Horsey says you're not scary, the boy announced. That's kind of horsey, Samuel replied seriously. I try not to be. Thomas climbed unbidden onto the bench beside him, a gesture that drew sharp attention from Margaret watching through the window. James says you bought us, like when Pa bought our milk cow. Samuel's hands stilled. How to explain this to a 5-year-old? It's not the same. People aren't like cows. Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that don't make much sense to fix problems. So we're not yours like Bessie was ours. You're here, Samuel said carefully. I'm making sure you have food and a safe place to sleep. But people don't belong to other people. Thomas, you belong to yourself and your family. Thomas pondered this with the gravity of childhood. Mama cries at night sometimes, not loud, but I hear her. Samuel's chest tightened. Change is hard. She's worried about keeping you all safe and happy. Are you gonna make us leave? No, son, not unless you want to go. Thomas leaned against Samuel's arm, a trusting weight that made something crack in Samuel's carefully maintained walls. I like it here. It's quiet, and there's good climbing trees. That there are, Samuel agreed, his voice rougher than intended. Eleanor witnessed this exchange from the doorway, her expression unreadable. That night at supper, she said, Mr. Thornton, Samuel, the children seem to be adjusting. It was the first time she'd used his given name. Such a small thing, but Samuel felt it like spring's first warm breeze. They're good children. You've raised them well. They've had to grow up fast. She passed the potatoes to James, who took them without his usual worried glance between the adults. I worry I've made them too careful. Careful's not bad out here, Samuel said. But they're remembering how to be children, too. That's good to see. After the children were abed, Eleanor surprised him by returning to the kitchen where he sat working on accounts. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, setting one before him. I've been watching you, she said without preamble, waiting for you to show your true nature. Men who buy women and children at auction. I thought I knew what kind they were. Samuel met her steady gaze. And now I don't know what to think. You work from dawn to dusk, but never demand we match your pace. You carved my son a toy, but don't expect affection for it. You could assert any claim over me. But you sleep in that cold little room and never even look at me the way men look at women they consider theirs. You're not mine, Samuel said quietly. You're a woman in need of shelter who happens to be sheltering here. That's all. Eleanor's hands wrapped around her cup, knuckles white. I keep waiting for the cost. Nothing comes free, Mr. Samuel, not in this world. The cost is what it's always been. A household needs running, children need raising, and I need— He stopped, uncertain how to voice his needs without sounding pathetic or predatory. You need not to be alone. Eleanor finished. I understand that. I do. But understanding and trusting are different things. I'm not asking for trust, just time. She stood, smoothing her apron. Margaret helped you with the bread. She told you? She didn't have to. She looked guilty as a cattle thief all through supper. A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. But she also looked proud. It's been a long time since I've seen that, so, time, yes, we can give that. As she climbed the stairs, Samuel remained at the table, ledgers forgotten. Through the window, stars pricked the endless prairie sky. He thought of Martha, of the dreams they'd shared beneath these same stars. Those dreams were gone, buried with her beneath the cottonwood tree. But perhaps new dreams could grow in their place, different, unexpected, but no less worthy of tending. In the morning, he would teach James to oil the wagon wheels. Margaret had mentioned wanting to practice her letters. Perhaps he'd offer the slate and chalk. Rose might enjoy learning which prairie flowers made the best dyes. And Thomas would simply continue being Thomas, bridging distances with the unthinking trust of childhood. Small steps, careful distances maintained even as they slowly narrowed. It wasn't the family he'd imagined building with Martha, born of love and hope, but it was a family nonetheless, growing from necessity and loneliness into something that might, given time and patience, bloom into belonging. The change came gradually as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust. Laughter, tentative at first, began to echo through the house that had known only silence for so long. It started with Thomas, whose natural exuberance couldn't be contained indefinitely. But soon his siblings joined in, their careful walls crumbling like old fence posts. Samuel was splitting firewood one crisp morning when he heard it, genuine, unguarded laughter from the kitchen. He paused, axe suspended, listening to the sound of Rose giggling at something Margaret had said. Eleanor's softer chuckle joined in, and Samuel found himself smiling at the woodpile. That evening, he built a swing. Nothing fancy, just rope and a plank sanded smooth, but he hung it from the massive oak beside the house, testing it with his own weight before calling it done. He said nothing, merely went inside for supper. But through the window he watched Thomas discover it, his whoop of joy bringing the others running. Can I? Thomas looked to his mother, bouncing on his toes. Eleanor glanced at Samuel, who was carefully focused on his plate. Mind your clothes, she said, which Thomas took as permission to fly. Soon all 4 children were taking turns, even Margaret forgetting her dignity long enough to soar into the evening air. Samuel ventured onto the porch with his coffee, settling into his chair to watch. Rose ran to him, breathless with excitement. Thank you, mister. Samuel, she said, the first direct words she'd spoken to him. Then, overcome by her own boldness, she darted back to wait her turn. The swing became a gathering place. Samuel often found the children there, Thomas making up wild stories about flying to the moon, James teaching Rose how to pump her legs to go higher, Margaret reading aloud while the others swayed gently. Their voices carried across the fields where Samuel worked, a constant reminder that the house no longer stood empty. The lessons began naturally. Samuel had mentioned the slate and chalk, and Margaret had seized on them with desperate hunger. She wrote until her fingers ached, copying passages from Samuel's few books, working sums he set for her. When he offered to help, she accepted with an eagerness that revealed how much her education had meant to her. I was going to be a teacher, she confided one evening as they worked through a geography lesson. Before Papa died, he said education was the best gift he could give us. Still could be, Samuel said. Cedar Hollow's got a school. Come spring, we could see about enrolling you all. Margaret's eyes widened. But the cost, that's my worry, not yours. Every child needs schooling. She bent over her slate to hide the tears that threatened. but Samuel saw them anyway. When Eleanor came to check on them, she found Margaret explaining the lesson to James and Rose, her natural teaching instincts already showing. James bloomed under Samuel's patient instruction. The boy had clever hands and a quick mind, absorbing everything from fence repair to crop rotation. He stopped flinching when Samuel approached, started asking questions that showed thought and planning. "Could we expand the chicken coop?" James asked one day, studying the existing structure. "If we had more hens, we could sell eggs in town." Samuel considered the boy. "That's good thinking. Draw up what you have in mind. We'll look at materials." James spent 3 evenings sketching plans, calculating board feet, estimating costs, when he presented his ideas. Samuel was impressed by the thoroughness. They built it together over the next week, James's pride in the finished coop shining brighter than the new tin roof. Rose found her courage in smaller ways. She began helping Samuel with the horses, showing a natural affinity for the animals. He taught her to braid their manes, to read their moods, to move safely around their massive bodies. Her quiet nature suited them, and soon even his most skittish mare would stand peacefully for her attention. One afternoon, Samuel returned from town to find Rose had organized a tea party in the barn. Thomas sat on an overturned bucket, the wooden horse a guest of honor, while Rose served imaginary tea in broken pottery she'd found. 2 barn cats attended as well, tolerating flower crowns with feline disdain. "Mr. Samuel!" Rose jumped up, then remembered her manners. "Would you like some tea?" Samuel removed his hat gravely. "I'd be honored, Miss Rose." He folded himself onto a hay bale, accepting an empty cup with proper ceremony. Thomas chattered about the party's elaborate backstory, while Rose poured careful imaginary tea. When Eleanor found them there, Samuel sipping from his broken cup with utmost seriousness, her expression softened in a way he'd never seen. The routines they developed felt natural, unforced. Breakfast together before the day's work began, Samuel reading aloud in the evenings while Eleanor mended and the children played quietly. Sunday drives to the creek for picnics when weather allowed. Small traditions that slowly wove them together. Thomas had taken to shadowing Samuel whenever allowed. The little boy would appear at his elbow, full of questions about everything from why birds flew south to how the pump brought water up from the ground. Samuel answered patiently, remembering his own father's gentle instruction. One day, Thomas approached with unusual solemnity. "Mr. Samuel, can I tell you a secret?" Samuel set down his hammer, giving the boy full attention. "If you want to." Thomas glanced around conspiratorially, then whispered, "Sometimes I forget Papa's face. Is that bad?" Samuel's throat tightened. "No, son, that's not bad. Faces fade. But the important things. How he loved you, what he taught you, those stay forever. Mama has a picture, but it doesn't look like how I remember." Thomas picked at a splinter on the fence post. "You don't look like him." "No, I don't suppose I do. But you're nice like he was. He built things too." Thomas brightened. "Maybe that's why you came to get us. Because you build things like Papa did." The simple logic of childhood. Finding patterns and meaning where adults saw only chance. Samuel ruffled the boy's hair. "Maybe so." That evening, Eleanor approached him after the children were abed. "Thomas told me what you said, about remembering." She twisted her hands in her apron. "Thank you. I worry about them forgetting Charles, but I don't know how to talk about it without—" She gestured helplessly. "Without the hurt taking over." Samuel finished. "I know." They stood on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Does it get easier?" Eleanor asked. "The missing?" "Different," Samuel said after a moment. "Not easier, exactly. But it changes shape, becomes something you can carry instead of something that carries you." Eleanor nodded slowly. "The children laugh now, real laughs, not the careful kind. I'd forgotten what that sounded like. They're healing. Children do that faster than grown folks." "And grown folks?" She turned to look at him. "Do we heal too?" Samuel met her gaze, seeing his own long loneliness reflected there. "Slower. But yes, I think we do." She went inside without another word. But the next morning there were fresh flowers on the breakfast table. Not wild flowers the children had picked, but deliberately chosen blooms from her kitchen garden. Small gestures, carefully offered, like hands reaching across a divide. The children noticed the shift, though they couldn't name it. Margaret smiled more, helped without being asked. James included Samuel in his plans naturally now, seeking approval, but not from fear. Rose left flowers on Samuel's chair, as well as hidden around the farm, and Thomas had taken to calling him Pa Samuel, without anyone suggesting it. One evening, as Samuel read from Pilgrim's Progress while Eleanor worked on a new shirt for James, Thomas interrupted from his spot on the floor. "Are we a real family now?" he asked with the directness of childhood. The room stilled. Margaret looked up from her slate, James from his whittling, Rose from her rag doll. Eleanor's hands paused mid-stitch. Samuel closed the book carefully. "What do you think makes a real family, Thomas?" The boy considered seriously. "Living in the same house, eating together, taking care of each other when someone's sick or sad." He counted on small fingers. "Laughing at James's jokes even when they're not funny." "Hey!" James protested, but he was grinning. "Reading stories," Rose added quietly. "And fixing things that break." Teaching each other. Margaret contributed. Being patient when someone makes mistakes. Keeping each other safe, James said, his voice deeper than his years. Eleanor set aside her sewing. "Then yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I think we are." Samuel looked around the room at these 5 people who'd come to him through circumstances no one would choose, who'd filled his empty house with noise and purpose and something that felt dangerously like hope. "I think so too," he agreed, and opened the book to continue reading. Later, after the children were settled for the night, Eleanor lingered in the kitchen. "They're starting to forget to be afraid," she said. "Of you, of this place, of what comes next. Is that bad?" "No." She wrapped her shawl tighter. "It's what I wanted, what they need. You're still waiting for the cost," Samuel said gently. She nodded, not denying it. "Every day I wake up expecting to find you've changed, that the kindness was performance. I'm not a perfect man, Eleanor. I've got moods and failings aplenty. But what you see is what I am, a lonely man who needed a family as much as you needed a home. The children love you." The words seemed pulled from her unwillingly. "Thomas talks about Pa Samuel constantly. Rose saves her best flowers for you. James works himself raw trying to earn your approval. And Margaret, she's planning lessons for the younger ones, talking about the future like she believes in it again." "And their mother?" Samuel asked quietly. "What does she think?" Eleanor was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, "Their mother is learning to believe in futures again too, slowly, carefully, but learning." She bid him good night and climbed the stairs, leaving Samuel alone with a banked fire in the settling house. Outside, wind moved through the prairie grass with a sound like whispers. Inside, boards creaked as children turned in their sleep, safe and warm and unafraid. The empty house was full, the silence broken. And if sometimes Samuel still woke reaching for Martha, if Eleanor still cried quietly in her room for the husband she'd lost, well, that was part of healing too, part of making space for new love while honoring the old. Tomorrow Thomas would help with chores, more hindrance than help but eager as sunrise. Rose would find new flowers to braid into the horses' manes. James would work on his coop expansion, planning for spring. Margaret would give lessons, her teacher's heart finding purpose. And Eleanor would put flowers on the breakfast table. Small gestures, carefully offered, hands reaching across the divide, finding purchase, holding on. The storm announced itself with a green-tinged sky and air thick as wet wool. Samuel had seen enough Kansas weather to recognize the signs. He hurried in from the fields, finding Eleanor already gathering the children, her face tight with worry. "It's a bad one coming," he said, unnecessarily. The wind was already picking up, sending dust devils spinning across the yard. "I've got candles and matches ready," Eleanor said, efficient despite her fear. "Children, help me fill the water buckets." They worked quickly, Samuel securing what he could outside while the family prepared inside. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. By the time he'd gotten the animals settled, the first fat raindrops were falling, driven horizontal by the wind. He burst through the door just as the sky opened fully. Thunder crashed so close the windows rattled, and Rose shrieked, running to her mother. Thomas stood frozen, his wooden horse clutched to his chest, while James tried to look brave despite his white knuckles gripping the table edge. "Downstairs," Samuel ordered, grabbing blankets. "Root cellar, now!" They descended into the earthen cellar, the sound of the storm muffled but still terrifying. Samuel lit a lantern, casting wavering shadows on the walls lined with preserved goods. The children huddled together on the old quilt he spread, Eleanor's arms around them all. Another crash, closer, louder. The house groaned above them. Thomas began to cry, the brave front he'd been maintaining finally crumbling. "I don't like it. Make it stop." Samuel knelt beside them. Without thinking, he began to speak, his voice low and steady beneath the storm's rage. "You know, Thomas, storms are just the sky having a tantrum, like when you get upset, but bigger." "The sky is mad?" Thomas hiccuped. "Maybe, or maybe it just needs to cry a while. Nothing wrong with crying when you need to." Samuel settled beside them, his solid presence seeming to push back the cellar's shadows. "My PA used to tell me stories during storms. Want to hear one?" Foreheads nodded. Even Eleanor leaned closer. "There was once a farmer, stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, who decided he was going to argue with the wind." Samuel wove the tale, his voice competing with the thunder, adding ridiculous details that made Thomas giggle despite his tears. When Rose whimpered at a particularly loud crash, Samuel shifted to let her burrow against his side. The storm raged for hours. Samuel told every story he could remember, then made up new ones. When his voice grew hoarse, Margaret took over, reciting from memory the lessons she'd been learning. James contributed riddles he'd heard in town. Even Eleanor shared a fairy tale from her own childhood. Through it all, Samuel noticed how naturally they'd arranged themselves, a tight knot of family with him somehow included in its center. Rose's hand clutched his shirt. Thomas had crawled into his lap. Margaret leaned against his other side, while James pressed close to his mother, who'd shifted nearer to Samuel than she'd ever been before. When Thomas's eyes began to droop, Samuel gently extracted himself to check above. The rain still pounded, but the worst seemed past. The house had held, though he could see water seeping under the door. "Is it over?" Eleanor asked when he returned. "Getting there. We'll give it another few minutes." He settled back down, Thomas immediately reclaiming his spot. Without thinking, Samuel began to hum, an old hymn Martha had loved. Eleanor's voice joined his, soft and uncertain at first, then stronger. The children listened, safe in the circle of adults who'd protect them from any storm, when they finally emerged. Dawn was breaking through dissipating clouds. The yard was a mess of broken branches and scattered debris, but the house stood firm. Samuel checked the damage while Eleanor got the children settled, exhausted from their night of fear. He was examining the barn roof when Eleanor found him. Her hair had come loose from its usual severe bun, making her look younger, more vulnerable. "Thank you," she said simply. "I couldn't have. They were so frightened, and I was too, and you." "We got through it together," Samuel said. "That's what matters." She studied him for a long moment. "Thomas wouldn't leave your lap, even asleep. He held on like you were the only safe thing in the world. He was scared. He was safe. They all knew it. So did I." She touched his arm briefly, the first voluntary contact she'd initiated. "You're a good man, Samuel Thornton." Before he could respond, she was walking back to the house, back straight but something softer in her bearing. Samuel stood among the storm debris, feeling like something more than weather had shifted in the night. The cleanup took days. The children helped eagerly, turning work into games. Thomas appointed himself Samuel's assistant, following him everywhere with comic seriousness. Rose made medicine from mud and flowers for the hurt trees. James and Samuel worked side by side repairing the chicken coop roof, the boy's confidence growing with each properly hammered nail. But it was Margaret who surprised him most. She appeared one afternoon while he was patching the barn wall, carrying a jar of water and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Mama says you've been working too hard," she said. "Offering both, and I wanted to say something." Samuel accepted the water gratefully. "What's on your mind?" "I hated you at first," Margaret said with her characteristic directness. "When you bought us, I thought you were just another man who saw us as things to use." She paused, choosing words carefully. "But you're not. You saved us twice, once from being separated, and once from that storm. You held Thomas while he cried and didn't make him feel ashamed. You treat Mama with respect. You teach us without making us feel stupid." "Margaret, I'm not finished." She took a deep breath. "I know we're not your real family, but you treat us like we are. And I wanted you to know that we're grateful. That I'm grateful." Samuel had to clear his throat twice before speaking. "You are my real family. Margaret, real as any family I know." She nodded once, sharply, then surprised them both by hugging him quickly before fleeing back to the house. Samuel stood stunned, the girl's fierce embrace having communicated more than any words could. That evening, the house felt different. The storm had washed away more than dust. It had cleared some invisible barrier. The children's chatter over supper was easier, more natural. When Eleanor's hand brushed his reaching for the bread, she didn't jerk away. Small changes. But Samuel felt them like green shoots after drought, after the younger children were abed. Eleanor brought her sewing to the porch where Samuel was working leather. They sat in companionable quiet, the evening air sweet with the scent of rain-washed earth. "Rose asked me something today," Eleanor said eventually. "She wanted to know if you were going to be their new papa." Samuel's hand stilled. "What did you tell her?" "I said that was something we'd all have to decide together." She set down her sewing to look at him. "The children have decided. I think Thomas calls you Pa already. The others want to, but think they need permission." "And their mother?" Samuel asked carefully. "What has she decided?" Eleanor was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "Their mother has been watching a man treat her children with more kindness than their blood relatives showed. She's seen him patient with their fears, gentle with their hearts, protective of their safety. She's watched him fill the empty places in their lives without trying to erase their father's memory." She stood, moving to the porch rail, looking out at the storm-cleaned prairie. "I came here expecting to be a servant. Maybe worse. Instead, I found a man still grieving his own losses but making room for ours. The children aren't the only ones who've been learning to trust again." Samuel rose to stand beside her, careful not to crowd. "I won't push for more than you're ready to give. Eleanor, this arrangement, however we name it, works as it is." She turned to face him, and in the last light of day, he saw something new in her expression. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The first shoots of something that might grow into love, given time and care. "The children need a father," she said. "A real one, not just a kind man who lets them stay in his house." "Eleanor, and maybe," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe their mother needs to stop being so afraid of needing things too." Thomas's voice called from inside, seeking reassurance before sleep, and Eleanor went to him. Samuel remained on the porch, heart beating strangely in his chest. Above, stars were beginning to appear in the storm-cleared sky. He thought of Martha, of the love they'd shared and lost. She would understand. He thought she'd always had the bigger heart, always saw the possible good in hard situations. She would look at these 5 souls who'd taken shelter in her house, and she would say, "Yes, yes, make them yours, and let them make you theirs." When Eleanor returned, she brought coffee and resumed her sewing without comment. But she sat closer than before, close enough that when Thomas called again, this time for Pa Samuel. Their hands touched as they both rose to go to him. Neither pulled away, and in that small contact, that tiny acknowledgement of connection, Samuel felt the last walls beginning to fall. Not all at once, too much hurt lived in both their pasts for that. But steadily, inevitably, like rain soaking into drought-hardened ground, bringing life back to places that had forgotten how to grow. The trip to town had become a family affair. All 6 of them crowded into the wagon on a crisp October morning. Samuel needed supplies for winter, and Eleanor had mentioned the children required new boots. They'd been living as a family for 2 months now. The initial wariness faded into comfortable routine. Cedar Hollow's Main Street bustled with Saturday activity. Samuel helped Eleanor down from the wagon while the children scrambled out behind them, Thomas immediately reaching for Samuel's hand, a gesture that still caught him off guard with its trusting simplicity. "Stay close," Eleanor instructed, but her tone was lighter than it would have been weeks ago. The town no longer felt like enemy territory. They moved through their errands efficiently, the mercantile for dry goods, the blacksmith to order hinges, the feed store for winter grain. Samuel noticed the looks they drew, heard the whispers that followed their passage, but paid them no mind. Let people talk. It was outside the general store that trouble found them. "Well, well." Edgar Pike's voice slithered across the wooden sidewalk. "The happy family." Samuel felt Eleanor tense beside him, saw Margaret pull Rose closer. Pike hadn't been seen in town since the auction, and his absence had been a blessing. Now he stood before them, clothes fancy but stained, eyes mean with drink despite the early hour. "Pike," Samuel acknowledged curtly, moving to guide his family around the man. But Pike stepped sideways, blocking their path. "How's married life treating you, Thornton? Getting your money's worth?" "Move aside," Samuel said quietly. Pike's attention shifted to Eleanor, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made Samuel's hands fist. "You clean up nice, Mrs. Simpson. Seems being bought suits you." "Her name is Mrs. Thornton now," Margaret said fiercely before anyone could stop her. Pike's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Is that so? Didn't hear about any wedding? Or maybe Thornton don't think his purchased goods need proper vows?" A crowd was gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Samuel spotted several men who'd been at the auction, their faces eager for drama. He needed to end this before it escalated. "The lady and children are with me," Samuel said, his voice carrying the same quiet threat that had backed down claim jumpers. "That's all anyone needs to know. The lady." Pike laughed, an ugly sound. "That what we're calling her now? Last I knew, she was just property. Property that should have been mine if you hadn't—" "Mama's not property." James stepped forward, thin shoulders squared. "And you can't talk to her like that." Pike's face darkened. He reached for the boy, whether to push him aside or grab him unclear, but his hand never made contact. Samuel moved faster than a man his size should be able, his hand closing around Pike's wrist with crushing force. "Don't," he said, the single word carrying enough menace to freeze Pike mid-motion. "You touch my son." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension, cold as January wind. "And I'll kill you myself." The crowd murmured at her words, at the claim of James as Samuel's son, at the fierce protectiveness in her stance. Pike jerked free of Samuel's grip, rubbing his wrist. "Your son?" he sneered. "Playing house doesn't make it real, woman. You're still what you were on that platform, goods for sale. And him." He gestured at Samuel. "He's just a lonely fool who paid too much for damaged merchandise." The crack of Samuel's fist against Pike's jaw was loud as a gunshot. Pike sprawled in the dust, blood streaming from his nose. He scrambled up, hand moving toward the pistol at his hip, but froze at what he saw in Samuel's face. "Draw it," Samuel said softly. "Please, give me the excuse." Pike had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who'd killed and would kill again without losing sleep. His hand fell away from his gun. "This isn't over," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "You can't just claim them like cattle. There's law." The law that sold them? Samuel stepped closer, and Pike scrambled backward. The law that let you bid on children, that law? Sheriff Watson pushed through the crowd, taking in the scene with weary resignation. Problem here, Sam? No problem, Samuel said, not taking his eyes off Pike. Mr. Pike was just leaving. Like hell, you heard him, Edgar. The sheriff's voice brooked no argument. Move along. Pike looked around for support, but found none. Even the men who'd shared his crude interests at the auction avoided his gaze. Cursing, he lurched to his feet and stumbled away, throwing threats over his shoulder that fooled no one. The crowd began to disperse, but not before Samuel heard fragments of conversation. About time someone put Pike in his place. Did you hear what the girl called her? Mrs. Thornton. The boy called him son. Seems they've made it official. Don't look too damaged to me. Look like a proper family. Sheriff Watson lingered. Pike's been drinking heavy since the auction. Owes money all over town, talking wild about things that weren't his to lose. He glanced at Eleanor and the children. You folks be careful. Whiskey and wounded pride make men stupid. After the sheriff left, they stood in awkward silence on the sidewalk. Thomas still clutched Samuel's hand, while Rose had buried her face in her mother's skirts. James's brave facade was cracking, the reality of confronting an adult settling over him. I'm sorry, Samuel began, but Eleanor shook her head. Don't. She lifted her chin, meeting the stares of lingering townspeople with defiance. He needed to be faced. They all do. Margaret surprised them by taking Samuel's other hand. Can we finish our errands? Rose needs those boots before her toes poke through. The simple practicality broke the tension. They continued their shopping, heads high despite the whispers. At the bootmaker's, Samuel insisted on sturdy boots for all 4 children, waving away Eleanor's protests about cost. Pa Samuel, Thomas piped up while being fitted. Are you really our papa now? The bootmaker paused in his measuring, clearly eager for the answer. Samuel met Eleanor's eyes over Thomas's head. Something passed between them, understanding, acceptance, perhaps even hope. If you'll have me, Samuel said simply. Yes, Thomas bounced, nearly kicking the bootmaker. Did you hear? He's our papa. The ride home was quieter, each lost in thought about the morning's events. But as they neared the homestead, Eleanor spoke. Margaret called me Mrs. Thornton. I heard James called you his father's defender. Boy's brave as his mother. Eleanor turned to study him. Pike will make trouble. Men like him always do when their pride's been hurt. Let him try. Samuel's voice was flat. I've dealt with worse than Edgar Pike. He said things about making it official. Samuel slowed the horses. Eleanor, I'd never pressure you. What we have, how we're building this family, it doesn't need town approval. But the children do, she said softly. They need to know they belong somewhere, to someone, that they're not just temporary. They're not temporary. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. None of you are. This is home, for as long as you want it. And if we want it to be more than an arrangement. Eleanor's voice was barely audible over the wagon's creaking. If we want what Margaret called me to be true. Samuel's heart hammered, but he kept his voice steady. Then we make it true, in whatever way feels right to you. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the children listening from the wagon bed, she said, the circuit preacher comes through next month. He does. Perhaps we should speak with him about making things official. For the children's sake. For the children. Samuel agreed, though his pulse suggested other reasons too. Behind them. Thomas whispered loudly. Does that mean a wedding? Hush, Margaret scolded, but she was smiling. Would there be cake? Rose asked hopefully. Of course there'd be cake. James said with big brother authority. All weddings have cake. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, free and unexpected. Samuel grinned. And suddenly the morning's ugliness seemed less important than this moment, this wagon full of family discussing cake with the serious importance only children could bring to such matters. As they pulled into the homestead, Samuel helped Eleanor down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "For the children," he repeated. "For the children," she agreed, but her eyes said more. They spoke of lonely nights ending, of houses becoming homes, of two wounded hearts learning to trust again. Thomas ran ahead, shouting to the chickens about becoming official, while his siblings followed with varying degrees of enthusiasm and embarrassment. Eleanor and Samuel stood by the wagon, watching their children, and that's what they were now, their children, raced toward the house that waited to shelter them all. "Pike was wrong," Eleanor said suddenly. "We're not damaged goods, not anymore." "Never were," Samuel corrected. "Just bent a little. Nothing that can't be mended with time and care." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Samuel saw in her eyes the same growing feeling that had taken root in his own heart. Not love yet, that would need more time, but the certain knowledge that love was coming, steady as seasons, sure as sunrise. "Come on," Eleanor said, linking her arm through his, the first time she'd done so voluntarily. "Let's go home." They walked toward the house together, the autumn sun warm on their faces, while somewhere in the kitchen Thomas was already planning the wedding cake, and life, despite all its sharp edges and hard corners, seemed very good indeed. The whispered conversation drifted down through the floorboards, soft voices in the darkness that Samuel recognized as Margaret and James. He'd risen for water and paused at the bottom of the stairs, not meaning to eavesdrop but caught by the earnestness in their tones. "Do you think he'll stay?" Rose's smaller voice joined in. "Really stay forever?" "Mama says he will," James answered. "But Papa said that too, before he got sick." "That wasn't Papa's fault," Margaret said firmly. "And Mr. Samuel, Pa, he's different. He chose us." "But what if Mama doesn't marry him?" Rose worried. "What if he decides we're too much trouble?" "Then I'll get a job," James declared with 10-year-old certainty. "I'll work the neighbors' farms. We won't go back to the auction." "Hush," Margaret soothed. "No one's going back anywhere. Didn't you see how he looked at Mama today? And how she looked back? Thomas says we're getting married." Rose giggled softly. "He told the chickens." "Thomas tells everyone everything," James grumbled, but fondly. "I want to call him Papa," Rose admitted. "But what if—" "What if what?" Margaret prompted. "What if he doesn't want us to? What if we're just practicing?" Samuel's chest tightened. He climbed the stairs quietly, pausing outside the door where lamplight showed beneath. He knocked gently. "Come in," Margaret called, and 3 guilty faces turned toward him as he entered. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked mildly, settling on the edge of Margaret's bed. Thomas, he noted, was sprawled in his own bed, deep in the sleep of the innocent. "We were just talking," James said defensively. "I heard." At their stricken looks, he raised a hand. "Not spying, just getting water. But since we're all awake, maybe we should talk about what's worrying you." The children exchanged glances. Finally, Rose, brave in the darkness, said, "Will you be our real Papa, not just pretend?" Samuel looked at each of them in turn, Margaret trying to be mature, James protective even now, Rose hopeful and frightened at once. "What makes a real Papa?" "Someone who stays," James said immediately. "Who doesn't leave when things get hard. Someone who teaches you things," Margaret added. "Who cares if you learn and grow? Someone who loves you even when you're bad," Rose whispered. "And who lets you love them back?" Samuel felt his throat close. "Then yes," he managed. "I want to be your real Papa, if you'll have me." "Even if we're not yours by blood?" James asked, the fear behind the brave words showing. "Especially then," Samuel said firmly, "because it means we chose each other. That's stronger than blood sometimes." Rose scrambled across the bed and into his arms, small and trusting. "Can we call you Papa now?" "I'd be honored." James stood straighter. "And you'll marry Mama, proper, in front of everyone." "If she'll have me, yes, in front of God and the whole town." "She will," Margaret said with teenage certainty. She smiles now. She hums when she cooks. She hasn't done that since Papa died. James finished. They sat quietly for a moment, Rose warm against Samuel's chest, the night peaceful around them. Then Margaret asked, "Do you love her, Mama?" Samuel considered lying, giving an easy answer, but these children had seen too much truth to accept comfortable falsehoods. "I'm learning to. She's teaching me how, just like you all are. My heart was closed up tight for a long time. You're all helping it open again." "Mama's was too," Rose said sagely. "But not anymore. Then we'll learn together," Samuel said. "All of us." A floorboard creaked in the hall. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, wrapper pulled tight, hair in a long braid. "I heard voices." She stopped, taking in the scene. "What's this?" "Family meeting," Margaret said. "About important things." Eleanor's eyes found Samuel's over Rose's head. "What kind of important things?" "About being real," Rose said. "Papa says we're real family. Chosen family." Eleanor's breath caught at the title, but her eyes remained on Samuel. "Did he now?" "And about weddings," James added. "With cake." "I see." Eleanor entered the room fully. "And what was decided at this midnight meeting?" "That we're staying," Margaret said. "All of us. Together. Forever." Eleanor's eyes shimmered in the lamplight. "That sounds like a very good decision." "Mama." Rose twisted to see her mother. "Are you going to marry Papa? He says he wants to marry you proper." Color rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she didn't look away from Samuel. "Did he? And what else did Papa say?" Samuel stood, lifting Rose easily. "That I'm learning to love your mama. That she's teaching me how to have a heart again." Eleanor moved closer, her children watching with held breath. "And I'm learning the same. From all of you. So there will be a wedding," James pressed. "A real one?" "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "If that's what everyone wants." "With cake," Thomas's voice piped up from his bed. Apparently not as asleep as he'd seemed. Laughter filled the room, breaking the tender tension. Samuel carried Rose back to her bed while Eleanor tucked in Thomas, who was already listing cake flavors. Margaret and James settled back under their quilts, the worry gone from their young faces. As the adults moved to leave, Margaret called softly, "Papa?" Samuel turned. "Yes." "Thank you for choosing us." "Thank you," he replied, "for letting me." Downstairs, Eleanor and Samuel stood in the kitchen, the intimacy of the moment upstairs lingering between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. They needed to hear it, to know it was real. "So did I," Samuel admitted. "Pike's words today, they stirred up doubts I didn't know I carried." Eleanor stepped closer. "We're not playing house, Samuel. What we're building here, it's real, messy and unexpected, but real." "I know." He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "The preacher comes in 3 weeks. 3 weeks." She caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. "That's not much time to plan a wedding. We don't need much, just us, the children, and someone to make it legal in the eyes of God and man." "And cake." Eleanor laughed softly. "Don't forget the cake." "Never." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, hands clasped, foreheads nearly touching. Upstairs, the children had settled back to sleep, safe in the knowledge that come morning, they'd still be family, still be home. The next morning brought rain, soft and steady, good for the winter wheat Samuel had planted. The family gathered for breakfast as usual, but something had shifted. Thomas called him Papa as naturally as breathing. Rose set his place with special care. James discussed plans for spring planting like a partner, not a boy trying to prove himself. And Margaret smiled more in that one meal than she had in all the weeks before. Eleanor moved around the kitchen with new lightness, her hand brushing Samuel's shoulder as she passed, accepting his help without the careful distance she'd maintained. When their fingers touched passing the coffee pot, neither pulled away. After breakfast, as rain pattered against the windows, Samuel found his family gathered in the parlor. Eleanor had pulled out her sewing basket, not for mending this time, but for something new. White fabric spread across her lap. "A wedding dress?" Rose breathed. "Just a good dress," Eleanor corrected, but her smile said otherwise. "Every woman needs one good dress." Margaret immediately offered to help with the hemming. James volunteered to polish Samuel's boots until they shine like new money. Thomas announced he would practice being a ring bearer with his wooden horse standing in for rings. Samuel watched from the doorway, struck by the scene's simple perfection. This was what he'd been missing, not just people to fill empty rooms, but the intricate dance of family life, each person contributing to the whole. That afternoon, a rider approached through the rain. Samuel recognized Tom Crawford, his neighbor, and went to meet him on the porch. "Heard there was some excitement in town yesterday," Tom said without preamble. "News travels fast. Pike's been making noise, talking about legal claims, about the auction not being binding." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Most folks think he's full of hot air, but thought you should know." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I appreciate the warning." Tom glanced toward the house where children's laughter spilled out. "Also heard there might be a wedding coming up. 3 weeks. When Reverend Mills comes through." Tom grinned. About time. Martha would be glad to see this house full again. After Tom left, Samuel found Eleanor had joined him on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the damp. "Pike won't give up easy," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, men like him never do." Samuel pulled her close, gratified when she didn't resist. "But he won't touch this family, I promise you that." Eleanor looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw steel that matched his own. "No," she agreed. "He won't. We've come too far, built too much. This is our home now, our family, our choice." The rain continued, washing the prairie clean. Inside, the children worked on their wedding preparations with the focused joy of youth. And on the porch, 2 people who'd thought themselves done with love stood together, guarding the future they were building from the ghosts of the past. 3 weeks. Then Eleanor Simpson would become Eleanor Thornton in truth. The children would have the security of a name to match their home. And Samuel would stand before God and the community to claim the family that had already claimed him. Pike could make all the noise he wanted. Some things, once chosen, couldn't be undone by threats or legal technicalities. Love was one of them. Family was another. The rain gentled to a whisper, and somewhere in the house, Thomas was explaining to his wooden horse about wedding cake. Samuel held Eleanor closer, and she leaned into him. 2 weathered souls finding shelter in each other while their children's laughter blessed the air around them. This was what home sounded like. This was what family meant. Not perfect, not without challenges, but chosen, claimed, cherished, and in 3 weeks, declared before heaven and earth, till death do them part. Thank you for listening to this story from the American frontier. I hope you enjoyed following Samuel, Eleanor, and the children on their journey from strangers to family. Where are you listening to this tale of the Wild West? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more authentic stories of love, courage, and redemption from America's frontier days. What did you think of Samuel and Eleanor's story? Share your thoughts below.